Micro Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize an outstanding athlete from Glasgow. Cara Powers is competing in her 4th year with St. FX University female hockey team. The flashy forward joined the Ridley College in St. Catharines, Ontario after completing her eligibility with the Scottsburn Dairy Bantam AAA team. During her graduation year, Minnesota State tried to recruit the talented forward. However, Cara's desire to return to her home province found her lacing up her skates for the ex-women. Power, who has played for Team Nova Scotia, Team Atlantic, and the Canada Games, is currently enrolled in education and will graduate in May 2017. I'd like all members of the legislature to join me and wish Cara great success in her future endeavours.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful member statements. Time allotted for those is now expired, and we'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Last week we learned that over a year ago the Premier formed a working group on carbon pricing. Mr. Speaker, we now know that the Ottawa Liberal government is going to force Nova Scotians to pay more for everyday items like heating their homes or driving their cars, Mr. Speaker, and that the choice that we are given is whether to pay directly through a carbon tax or indirectly through a cap-and-trade system. I'd like to ask the Premier to confirm for this House and for all Nova Scotians, is he considering a cap-and-trade system for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question and tell him, as I told him last week, continue the negotiations with the national government to ensure that the hard work that Nova Scotians have been doing in terms of reducing our greenhouse gases are recognized, Mr. Speaker, and we're prepared to help, as I'm sure all Canadians are, to ensure that we reach our global target of reduction in GHGs, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe there's one way that it can be done. There are other innovative ways to do that, Mr. Speaker, and unlike the Leader of the Conservative Party, I'm much more optimistic about the future of this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we keep asking the question because we're optimistic the Premier will actually give us a direct answer, and more important than us, all Nova Scotians. He has said he does not want to impose a carbon tax. That's good, but he stays silent on the obvious other of the two options that we're being forced to look at, which is a cap-and-trade system, Mr. Speaker. This is a pattern. After all, the Premier was perfectly fine to take the efficiency tax, which he was against, and hide it on our power bills instead of get rid of it like he promised, Mr. Speaker. Now it appears he's looking at finding a new hidden tax through a cap-and-trade system, Mr. Speaker. So let's just ask him, is he looking at hidden ways of taxing Nova Scotians more, like the cap-and-trade system that Ottawa's forcing on us?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there was no power increase last year. There's a decrease this year, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians recognize this government is standing with them, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to their pocketbook.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when the Premier was in opposition, he was very clear. He said, and I quote, "A tax is a tax is a tax." And I will table that quote for the benefit of everyone in this House, Mr. Speaker. Now he's been asked repeatedly if he's looking at another hidden tax. First he hid the efficiency tax on our power bills. Now he won't deny that he's looking at a new hidden tax for Nova Scotians under a cap-and-trade system, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why will he not simply be direct with Nova Scotians and rule out the hidden tax that is cap-and-trade?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind him again, as I said at the very beginning of the question period last week, I'll say it again, we're ongoing negotiations with the national government to make sure that Nova Scotians are recognized for the hard work that they've been doing. We're going to continue to do so, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue every day to defend the people of Nova Scotia, whether they're dealing with the national government or anyone else, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're very encouraged by the report of BMO saying that Atlantic Canada is leading the region in growth, Mr. Speaker. That's a positive sign. We're seeing great signs in economic development across this region, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to move this province forward, despite what the Leader of the Conservative Party continues to talk about.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, awarding a civil servant's position to Marilla Stevenson has led many Nova Scotians to further question the hiring practices of this government. Ms. Stevenson was asked by the head of the Public Service Commission to take a crack at writing a job prescription for the position, of which Ms. Stevenson would eventually be the only applicant. On top of this, Ms. Stevenson's personal service contract was retroactive, renewed, to make her eligible for the position. position. So my question, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, how is this possible that this hiring process was fair and void of any conflict of interest?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. There are many hardworking Nova Scotians across the province who come to work for the government, provide their skills and services that require time. Ms. Stevenson is working on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia and the government. Job opportunity came available. She applied for it, Mr. Speaker. She's continuing to provide service for the people of Nova Scotia. And we're going to continue to reach out and find people, Mr. Speaker, who help us deliver the services to the people of this province so that we continue to see the positive growth that we're seeing in our province, whether it's in service delivery or whether it's in economic growth.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, being a political staffer should not preclude one from ever working as a civil servant. However, one should be hired using fair hiring practices. In this instance, a new position was created. Therefore, why not open it up for all competition? Instead, this new position was made available only to a handful of people in the Executive Council's office. So I asked the Premier, what was the purpose of limiting the competition for the newly created position to just those in the ECO?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member know, if he doesn't, he should ask his friends in the labour movement, Mr. Speaker. That is a common practice. If they want to open it up across the entire private sector, including those that are unionized, Mr. Speaker, I'm more than prepared to make that change.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the Premier argued that there is no more money for teachers. Yet in this case, someone who worked closely with the Premier was offered a pay raise of a new six-figure salary position. I repeat, six-figure salary position, Mr. Speaker. This is a difficult financial lesson for teachers to understand. So I asked the Premier, why is there money for raises for those in the inner circle, but no money for teachers who are the backbone of our educational system?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he well knows, the position that was being posted and taking on added responsibilities, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member should know he just took on added responsibilities and, quite frankly, pocketed almost $25,000 for taking on those added expenses. Why should everyone else be treated differently than him?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new report for the federal government now says that increasing carbon pricing, whether directly through a tax or indirectly through cap and trade, to levels beyond Canada's trading partners will create, and I quote from the report, competitive concerns, Mr. Speaker, for any business that does export to the United States. Well, many Nova Scotia companies rely on the American market to create jobs here, Mr. Speaker, and to grow. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, adding a hidden carbon price or a carbon tax directly will only cost Nova Scotians jobs. The report makes that very clear, and I'll table that for the benefit of the Premier and all members present, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has a working group on carbon pricing. I'd like to ask him, how many jobs has his working group on carbon pricing estimated this new tax or pricing will cost Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, he's creating a whole bunch of hypothetical and scare tactics across the province. Nova Scotians have recognized over the last 3 years that this government will stand beside and continue to defend our province and the hard-working people in this province, Mr. Speaker. As he should know, by the fact power rates have not gone up, they've gone down under our leadership.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, you know what Nova Scotians are scared of? Digging deeper into their pocketbooks, whether it's the Liberal government in Ottawa or the Liberal government here in Halifax, Mr. Speaker, whether it's the efficiency fee on their power bill, whether it's a new carbon tax, whether it's cap and trade that the Premier refuses to rule out for Nova Scotians, even though they already have one of the highest costs of living in the country, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're pursuing this. Now there are real jobs on the line, Mr. Speaker, real jobs in our businesses that do business with the United States, Mr. Speaker. This should be the first and most important priority of any Premier of the province. So I'll ask this Premier, did he even ask his working group on carbon pricing to consider the effect on jobs in our economy?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I again want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, we're retaining more young people per capita in the Canadian province. We're seeing the private sector step up, hire not only our sons and daughters, but new Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing positive changes across the province, and now BMO has announced recognizing that Nova Scotia will lead Atlantic Canada the strongest growth in 6 years, Mr. Speaker. Those are all positive signs.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also for the Premier. On Friday, just outside this chamber, we saw the Premier engage in a personal and inappropriate exchange with a journalist. A Halifax Examiner article, which I can table, described the Premier's comments as, quote, exactly what the term mansplaining was invented for. As a former journalist, I value the work of the press gallery. I know these professionals do not want to be at the centre of the story. I think we can all agree that this type of behaviour sets a poor example for other government members and is certainly not what the people of Nova Scotia expect from their Premier. Mr. Speaker, would the Premier wish to take this opportunity to rise in this House and apologize for his conduct?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I too want to recognize the great work by those, Mr. Speaker, in the press gallery across this province. Mr. Speaker, I've dealt with them now for the last 10 years. There's often a back and forth exchanges in that, Mr. Speaker, but I'm going to continue to do and defend the positions that we have as a government as they continue to hold us to account. And I want to thank them for the great work that they do on behalf of their readership, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, along with their staff, recently agreed to a policy on the prevention and resolution of harassment in the workplace. This policy states that everyone has a right to be treated with respect and has a responsibility to treat others the same way. Although the journalists who cover the House are not included in this policy, the legislature is our shared workplace. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell us what is being done to ensure this type of behaviour is not condoned and similar incidents will not happen again?
Order, please. I'm going to disallow the question. A clerk has brought to my attention, according to O'Brien and Boss, the rules of which we follow in this legislature in Chapter 11, page 503, a question should not reflect on the character or conduct of chair occupants of this House of Assembly. So we'll move along. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a week before the last provincial election, the Premier signed a letter to the Centre for Law and Democracy promising to expand the powers and mandate of the FOIPOP review officer. And I have that letter here, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that for the House. In the last 3 years, he has done nothing of the kind, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier, he won't even answer basic questions about whether he's looking at a cap-and-trade system or some other indirect method of taxing Nova Scotians more. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier commit today to keeping his promise and making the FOIPOP review officer an officer of this House and granting her the order-making powers that he promised in writing in the run-up to the last election?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank all those FOIPOP officers across the government, Mr. Speaker, who continue to ensure that the data and information is being asked for by whether it's the opposition parties or Nova Scotians who request that information is being provided to them as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, instead of a thanks, an apology is really in order when the Premier makes a promise in writing and then breaks it so flagrantly after the election is over. In fact, Mr. Speaker, just last month the Premier openly admitted that he regularly flaunts our FOIPOP laws and the duty to record the decisions that he makes so that they can be subject to Freedom of Information requests. Mr. Speaker, those actions were found by the very same Centre for Law and Democracy to be undermining transparency and ultimately undermining democracy itself, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that quote for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier commit today to stop undermining our FOIPOP laws and legislate that the FOIPOP officer will in fact report to this House, and will he follow both the letter and the spirit of the law that he promised he would strengthen when he was running for office.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure him that any FOIP pops that come into government, Speaker, are dealt with outside of me and outside of the members of the Executive Council, are dealt by the very people in the FOIP pop officer, Mr. Speaker. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, I actually do prefer talking to people. It's something he should try.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. When it comes to the ongoing impasse between teachers, union leadership and government, parents just expect the Premier and the Minister of Education to work it out. In a new ad campaign launched by the NSTU leadership, the union states is ready to talk. My question to the Minister, will the Minister commit to going back to the table today so we can be assured there will be no disruption in the school year?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I certainly have said to teachers directly and indirectly as recently as this morning that there were certainly some articles in the agreement that the membership did not support and did not ratify that would bring all of the interested and key partners to the table. That was under the Partnership on Systemic Working Conditions, and that was very much a part of the agreement that was not supported, and that would bring together members of the department, members of the school board, and members of the teachers union to talk about the very issues that teachers want, and that is to talk about working conditions. We had that, we were excited about that, and to that end, Mr. Speaker, we reached out to the teachers union to come on board, to sit down with us, and I will table that letter. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians simply don't trust their premiers or this Liberal government's rhetoric on labour relations. To be frank, many believe they want a strike to suit their political agenda. My question to the Minister, why won't the Minister just admit she's playing politics and putting her classrooms in jeopardy?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite would know, he and I both had great careers in education. We went to work every morning. I can speak for myself. I can't speak for him, but I think most teachers went to work every morning believing that they could make a big difference in the lives of the kids in their class. That's what motivated me. That's what motivates many of the teachers we have in this province. We recognize there are complex issues in the classroom. We want to help them.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister of Education noted earlier, this week is School Bus Safety Week, so I have a question related to that. Mrs. Danielle Robertson lives with her family in Queens, Shelburne. Her two children, aged 11 and 13, attend South Queens Middle School. Their school day starts at 7:45, but they need to get the bus at 6:25 a.m. This year, they'll not be playing hockey because if they attended practices, they'd not be able to get enough sleep. And Mrs. Robertson calls this situation the most stressful thing in her family's life. So my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is, does she think it's acceptable for young children to start their days at such an early hour?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The very issue of which the member speaks is one that was brought to my attention by the MLA who sits beside her, the leader in the House, and that very issue was taken back to the school board, recognizing that it is a very early start, but the school board have looked at busing routes, and that is certainly a decision of the school board, and I will continue to work with the member from Queens Shelburne on that issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the situation in Queens Shelburne is actually because of the need for double bus runs. Once the school bus drops off one set of children, it heads back to pick up more. The school day should be organized around what's best for children and families. It shouldn't be based on the inability to pay for a second bus. The Minister has a history of saying that this type of decision is not her responsibility, that it rests with the school board. So my question for the Minister is this. Since she is actually responsible for determining the budgets for school boards, will she please agree to provide the South Shore Regional School Board with enough money to pay for an additional bus to help families like the Robertsons?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member has indicated, those decisions are school board decisions. We certainly are very much aware of any concerns that school boards have, and we respond to any specific asks that they have. But we believe that the funding to that school board has been adequate. The decisions they make about the schedule for their students and the bus runs that they have is a board decision.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On September 8th, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia wrote a letter in which he said, quote, significant feedback was received about a liquor license application for a proposed lounge at 211 Main Street in Dartmouth, and that shows the license process works to notify residents. Now, that process he talked about includes a notice on Twitter and a poster on the building which would have required residents to trespass across the property to read. Mr. Speaker, I'll table that letter. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell me how many people the significant feedback he referred to represents?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my colleague. My colleague is familiar with the processes that are applied to advertising any applications for liquor licensing. We continue to work to improve on that process. I don't have the numbers that my colleague is looking for, but certainly willing to find those for him.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the number is 12. Mr. Speaker, his own staff were able to tell me that 12 people responded. Now, when Councillor Tony Mancini and I went door to door to let people just in the neighbourhood know about this, over 100 people then showed up at a meeting, almost all of whom told his staff and the councillor and myself that there should have been a public meeting held by his department. So, Mr. Speaker, I accept that obviously the Minister was not given accurate information before writing the letter and claiming there was significant feedback, because 12 can hardly be considered significant. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commit to reviewing the process for notifying residents in the area of proposed liquor license applications?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I can tell my colleague that I've had discussions as recently as yesterday specific to the process and the need to ensure that the broad community is familiar with the process. We'll continue with that work and engage the industry as we move those efforts forward.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's Auditor General's report revealed that government agencies, boards and commissions are not yet required to disclose travel and hospitality expenses, and this is 1 year after the Auditor General recommended that the senior management of agencies, boards and commissions should be required to disclose these expenses. And in response to this, when it came up in public accounts, the government said that a directive to require such disclosure would go out, but not until the end of the year. And I'd like to ask the Minister of Internal Affairs, why is he dragging his feet on increasing government transparency and accountability?
The honourable member of Minister for Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, this falls under the Finance Minister.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to advise the member opposite that, in fact, the letter directive out to the agencies and boards actually went out about a week or two ago from my office. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister to table that letter for the benefit of the House, and I was surprised that the Auditor General wasn't aware of this. He was clearly quite offended by what was happening, and rightfully so after a full year. And in light of the brewing spending scandals in some municipalities, the Minister of Municipal Affairs has been musing publicly about cracking down on municipal spending, and I'm sure some people would see the irony in that when we had this department sitting on an Auditor General's recommendation for a full year and finally deciding to act upon it in the last couple of weeks. So maybe the Minister can explain what took so long.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Sure, Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy. I think it'll take longer than 1 minute or 45 seconds, Mr. Speaker, to explain to the member opposite all of the governance rules and responsibilities. While the directive was of a financial nature that went out from my office, Mr. Speaker, all those agencies, crowns and corporations, Mr. Speaker, do not directly report through me. So there's a process and a governance structure in place to ensure that the appropriate authorities were in place in order to move this through, Mr. Speaker. And so that authorization went forward, Mr. Speaker. Happy to table the letter for the benefit of the members of the legislature. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, although the directive just went out recently, in fact, they will be required to report all the way back to April of 2016.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Internal Services. In June, Nova Scotians were shocked to learn former Chronicle Herald columnist Marilla Stevenson turned an 18-month contract into a full-time gig as one of Premier McNeil's top advisors in the civil service.
Order, please. Just like to remind the honourable member not to refer to other members with their surname. The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry. The Premier's top advisors in the civil service. After more questions were asked, it was uncovered that Mrs. Stevenson's actually had a hand in writing her own job description. My question to the Minister, does the Minister believe that it's acceptable for a contract employee to write their own job description to ensure they are a shoo-in for a government job?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure this House that fair hiring practices were followed in this, as they are in all jobs.
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I would also like to thank the person that the opposition is talking about for the great job she is doing in government and how she's helping One Nova Scotia come to fruition. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, obviously those hiring practices weren't being followed when someone could write their own job description and be the only person from within to apply for that job. Being hired directly from a contract position into the civil service with a full-time permanent job is not an easy thing, Mr. Speaker. All this seriously brings into question the government's hiring practices. On top of that, the messy follow-up and spin doctoring of answers to the media suggests a cover-up. It took 4 days and 15 people to get a simple answer to the question, where was the job posted and how many people applied? So my question to the Minister is, how can anyone trust this government and this Minister when these kinds of shady hiring practices and insider jobs could leave a cloud of suspicion around the inner circle?
Order, please. I'd like to remind the honourable member the term shady is unparliamentary. The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I can assure this House that fair hiring practices were followed in this, as they are in all jobs in the province of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Service, Nova Scotia. In June of this year, the Government of Ontario announced it was removing gender markers from health cards and driver's licenses. In the release, the Ontario Minister of Health says the purpose of health cards is to show that the card holder is eligible for public health care. A person's sex is not relevant. My question to the Minister is, will the Minister agree to remove gender markers from Nova Scotia government-issued IDs?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. We've worked very close, Mr. Speaker, with stakeholders around this subject, most recently with birth certificates in the province of Nova Scotia. We continue to engage the community here in these circumstances, and certainly we'll continue those discussions as the public would expect.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, trans and non-binary Nova Scotians can face discrimination and harassment when their government ID does not align with their gender expressions. So, Mr. Speaker, what does the Minister plan to do to ensure trans and non-binary people are not at risk of transphobia because of gender markers on government ID? And when will this plan be realized?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated in response to the first question, we continue to work with the lesbian, gay, transgender, queer community, Mr. Speaker. We have an open dialogue. It was that community who brought forward considerations around the birth certificates. We'll continue to engage that community, Mr. Speaker, and entertain all points of concern that they bring to our attention.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, a question for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, did you know that Nova Scotia and the Yukon are the only two jurisdictions in Canada that don't have the Conflict of Interest Commissioner as an officer of the legislature? and the independence that offers to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner. Now, we know the Premier has taken a very progressive stance, wanting to make Nova Scotia the most transparent province in the country. When will the Minister of Justice bring Nova Scotia into line with the rest of the country and into line with the Premier's commitment, and make our Conflict of Interest Commissioner here in Nova Scotia an officer of the legislature?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member opposite bringing this to my attention. I was not aware that there were only 2 jurisdictions at the moment that have that situation, although we certainly have to do more research to see if they all report to the legislature. I'm not certain if that is the case or not, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, last month Nova Scotia's Conflict of Interest Commissioner made his first appearance in front of a legislative standing committee. And at the Human Resources Committee, Justice Nunn told the committee, and I quote, "I think the safest place for the Conflict of Interest Commissioner to be is an officer of the legislature, because that means that he's dealing with the legislature in important issues." And I can table that. My question for the Minister: does the Minister disagree with Nova Scotia's Conflict of Interest Commissioner, and does that present a possible conflict of interest?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the play on words as well. That's always good. Yeah. And Mr. Speaker, I think that we all know Justice Nunn has done a tremendous job as the Conflict of Interest Commissioner for many years. I think he's been there for all the years that I've been a member of the legislature, 19 years I'm hearing, and I know he does a tremendous job on behalf of all of us. He is very responsive. He answers our questions. He keeps our records and ensures that we are following all of the rules that are required. So at present, I have the utmost confidence in the work that he's doing and the structure that we have. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. Last year, the government went back and forth on plans to increase pharmacare premiums for seniors in this province. And once they realized the impact of the short-sighted decision, they promised they would consult seniors before they made more changes. It is time that they start keeping their promises and were accountable to Nova Scotians. So my question to the Premier, can the Premier assure seniors that they will know the outcome of any pharmacare changes before they organize their own personal budgets for 2017?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're running out of months here before they actually have to make that decision. As you know, Mr. Speaker, seniors are on a fixed income. By the time January rolls around, they're trying to make their adjustments for their full season. So that only gives us 2 more months now to consult thoroughly with these seniors groups. We know that under this government that the cost of living for all Nova Scotian seniors has already been stretched beyond their limited budgets, and these people have committed and worked for our communities their whole lives. So my question to the Premier, can the Premier guarantee that any changes to pharmacare will not have a serious impact on seniors' fixed incomes?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. We've said that we'd be going out consulting with seniors across the province. We're committed to that before any changes are made, Mr. Speaker, to pharmacare. Wanting to go out and have that full conversation with them in the process of starting to do that. We'll continue to do so. And, Mr. Speaker, no changes will be made to pharmacare until seniors' voices are heard, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. In 2013, Feed Nova Scotia provided assistance to 36,140 Nova Scotians. 2015, the number of individuals needing assistance has risen to 43,682. Since this government took office, food bank usage has increased by over 7,500 people, including 2,500 children. Over the past year, food banks have had to appeal to the public to help with shortages caused by this increased need. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister's plan to get families and children out of food bank lines?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. Over the last number of years, she would know, and many people in here would know, that we're going through a major transformation within the delivery of community services in the province of Nova Scotia. It's a very ambitious agenda. It hasn't been done for 30, 40 years. Part of that is looking at the benefits package and certainly working with our federal counterparts on the child tax benefit, which I'm pleased to inform that we did not touch in terms of when that increase went up over the summer. And we also had the largest increase in the history of the program of $20 last year. So all of this becomes part and parcel, and we'll continue to work on our transformation.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, of the thousands of Nova Scotians who had to get their food from food banks last year, more than 13,000 were children. This government has been patting itself on the back repeatedly, congratulating itself about posting a surplus while families across the province do not have enough to eat. Mr. Speaker, does the minister find it acceptable that in this small province, more than 13,000 children have to rely on food banks for their meals?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I would just like to say that when I became minister, my department budget was $898 million. Under this government, it's now close to $930 million. There have been investments in community services across the board, whether it be persons with disabilities, income assistance, employment support, or child welfare. There have been numerous and there have been significant investments by this government in community services.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, the Kentville Bridge over the Cornwallis River is one of the oldest steel bridges in the province and has long been in need of replacement. It's an important transportation link across that river. And in fact, the Minister has already announced a new bridge. My question for the Minister is, when will work on that new bridge begin?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. I know that the bridge is very important to the community he represents in the surrounding region. The tender for that bridge has been awarded, $4.5 million to Dexter Construction. They're working with Nova Scotia Power to remove some of the power lines and make rerouting so they can get on the job right away. They're fully anticipating that they get a good start on it this year, hopefully to do a bulk of the work, but we'll see that completed probably in the third quarter of 2017. But it has been awarded to Dexter, and it will begin this fall. Thanks.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that question. In fact, my next question was, when will the tender be awarded? And I appreciate his answer. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. First of all, I just want to thank him for the phone call that he did get to me when we were talking about the drought conditions in southwest Nova Scotia. It's really funny. Cape Breton gets a flood, we get a drought. It seems to be a sort of a quandary of problems across this province. We could have used some of that water, but maybe not all of it. But in the crux of our conversation was sort of what are we doing short-term and long-term for the residents of southwest Nova Scotia. Short-term, of course, is providing water, but the second part was, are we going to be doing some geology, some water tests to find out what the long-term impact of a drought in southwest Nova Scotia are going to be?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. He described the complexity of governing a province when we have the situation that took place in Sydney and Cape Breton, and then, of course, what's happening in southwestern part of the province that he's a constituent of and a member of. The government has, looking at, as you well know, this has been an ongoing problem for quite some time. There's a tremendous number of dug wells down in that area. We're looking at many options that are available in the short term, and then looking, is there a long-term way to work with those individual homeowners and community members to provide to ensure that we have a long-term sustainable source of water for those communities.
The Honourable Member. The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member, the Premier, for that answer. But what I want to impart upon him and his cabinet is that maybe there's some data that the communities require so that they can make decisions as well. Because we know full well, lots of well references here, but we know full well that digging a new well might not be the solution in some cases. So is there an opportunity to bring in in the Minister of DNR, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, of Community Services, in order to look at the long-term viability of water service in southwestern Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question and the leadership of the Minister of Municipal Services. That work is beginning to happen, looking at the expertise that we have in other departments to come together to fully understand what we're dealing with for a long-term solution, as well through his department working with our municipal partners to ensure that there are many options, because what will work for one region of the area may not work for another, or one community. What works for one homeowner may not work for another. So we're looking to make sure that we pull together all of the resources that we have in those departments, deal specifically with this issue and respond to it in a thoughtful way, so those citizens then can make informed decisions about what's right for their individual household, and we collectively can work together to find out what's right for that community.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Last Friday, I asked the Minister to explain why this government's announcement it was stepping away from the commitment of natural resources strategy to reduce clear-cutting to no more than 50% of all harvests. The Minister said, and I quote, "There has been no decision to take that action that he's talking about," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the Minister's comments run counter to the CBC report that claims the Minister's 5 years update officially abandons the clear-cutting recommendation, and I will table that. So I asked the Minister, given that we are at the 5-year mark and the target is yet to be reached, can he clarify what his government stand on the 50% clear-cut target?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. Mr. Speaker, forestry is not just about numbers, Mr. Speaker. It's about the 11,500 people in Nova Scotia who are employed in this industry. 11,000 people that work in this industry. We work scientifically with the ecosystem to determine the process that's going. The update that we gave in the natural resource strategy is simply that. Mr. Speaker, it's a snapshot in time, 5-year period, and I would suggest that not everything you hear on the CBC or in the media reflects the actual state of affairs.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If it's not about numbers, but yet I get numbers for a response. Mr. Speaker, when asked about clear-cutting target on Friday, the Minister said, and I quote, "We have listened to Nova Scotians and will follow the science-based decision-making process," end quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, it sounds like the Minister has come across some new fancy science that we were previously unaware of when the target was originally set. So, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Minister, can he tell us what new fancy science report he has uncovered, and will he table that by the end of this session?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our goal is unchanged. We are doing what the public has asked. As a matter of fact, there is tremendous new science available in the fibre industry. I would invite the member to visit the former Bowater plant, which perhaps is in his constituency, to see the wonderful things that are being done there to convert cellulose to diesel fuel. So let's talk about new science. Let's talk about rebuilding our industry in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, it is known that Nova Scotians pay some of the highest provincial income taxes in Canada. Nova Scotians are paying 17% more in taxes than they paid just 4 years ago. That means hardworking Nova Scotians take less money home to their families but give more to government. Will the Minister of Finance admit that this government is gouging Nova Scotians with skyrocketing taxes?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we thank the member opposite for the question, Mr. Speaker. What I can let the member opposite and all the members of the legislature know, Mr. Speaker, is how much this government continues to invest in programs and services that Nova Scotians value. such as in the healthcare sector, and home care, Mr. Speaker, and education and community services, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to invest in those priorities of the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and that's where the hard-earned tax dollars provided to the government go on behalf of all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know Nova Scotians pay $850 more in tax than they did in 2012. When the Ottawa Liberals imposed their carbon pricing scheme on Nova Scotians, families will have to shoulder $1,250 more in taxes each year. This is a party that used to want a lower HST. They said they would eliminate bracket creep and put an end to tax on gas, but did nothing once they were elected to any of these. When will this government start growing the economy and start giving taxpayers a break?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member again opposite for the question. I believe the last part of that question, there's a lot of elements to it, but asking about when we're going to start growing this economy, Mr. Speaker, and if the member opposite reviewed the BMO report that just came out, indeed, Nova Scotia is leading Atlantic Canada for economic growth, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, drought conditions continue to impact the lives of thousands of residents across the province with no end in sight. Many household wells remain dry. Currently, many Nova Scotians are relying on bottled water for cooking and drinking and on provincial park facilities for their showers every morning. However, with the winter on the way, these facilities are likely to close in the next few months, leaving these same individuals in a very precarious situation. My question is it the expectation of this government that Nova Scotians will be bathing in bottled water, or is there a plan to address their urgent water shortage?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do want to thank the member for the question. We, of course, share her concern as we get closer and closer to the winter season about the impact that this water shortage is having on many households. We are actively working with all municipal units to develop solutions to the unique circumstances that people are faced with in each community, and we will be moving on those if the need requires. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, the fact remains that this government has not communicated a tangible plan to the residents who are wondering in southwest Nova. Over 1,000 families have reported their dry wells to the province, some all the way back to August. This is all the more distressing given that Nova Scotia is expected to experience more extreme droughts as our climate continues to change. So we really need a plan and an action plan before the ground freezes for the winter. So that's what we're asking the minister give us. Nova Scotians need to know, what is the plan of the government if water levels in household wells are not restored in the next few weeks?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am very happy and appreciative of all the work that our local volunteers have done on the ground, our EMO officials, our municipal governments, our volunteer fire departments, Coast Guards, volunteers. All these people have really worked to ensure that everybody who is without water right now is receiving it for daily use and for drinking. The province has been shipping bottled water out weekly and sometimes daily to all those affected communities, Mr. Speaker. Each situation in each community does vary, and we will be working directly with those communities and those municipalities to develop a tailored solution to the challenge that each of those communities face in the event that this does continue, Mr. Speaker. But of course, all of us here in the meantime are hoping for rain.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The federal government has failed to deliver on its promise to restore the Canada Health Transfer Tax, or transfers, to its original funding levels. Nova Scotia has an aging population and a high prevalence of chronic disease. For years, the PC caucus has advocated for these factors to be taken into consideration by the government, but the federal Liberals have abandoned that promise by the sound of the Minister Philpott. The Premier must be accountable to Nova Scotians and make sure that this change of heart by the federal Liberals doesn't impact our health care. So can the Premier outline specific steps to ensure that Nova Scotia's healthcare system will not suffer a serious funding loss?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. Even though those changes that were made to the federal transfer was made by the Harper government, Mr. Speaker, what our Minister of Health is doing now with his colleagues from across Canada is now in Ottawa. Yesterday, provincial territorial ministers were meeting. All Canadian jurisdictions wanted to commit to and are looking to commit to a 6% increase in healthcare funding. The national government is meeting with them today. They have a position. That negotiation is ongoing, Mr. Speaker. And when we come to a final conclusion of what that negotiation looks like, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member will have some input on that.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Federal Minister of Health, in her speech yesterday, has said that they will not consider giving provinces more funding until they show innovation. And too many people in this province are already not receiving the health care that they deserve. Just look at the doctor shortage across this province. So my question to the Premier, will he guarantee Nova Scotians that our health care system will meet the requirements by the federal government for innovation so that we can receive the health dollars necessary to protect the people of this province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The federal health minister was in town to announce My Health NS, which is a first of its kind of any Canadian province, Mr. Speaker, to ensure personal health records for every Nova Scotian. Ongoing talk about innovation around one person, one record, Mr. Speaker. As you know, so we announced last week, about a month ago now, hiring more nurse practitioners and more family practice nurses for our collaborative practice teams. 14,000 more Nova Scotians have access, Mr. Speaker, to a family physician and primary care health team. Continuing to work with our federal partners, Mr. Speaker, continuing to work with our colleagues across the province to make sure that we deliver the services that Nova Scotians expect in their community, Mr. Speaker. He keeps talking, so I think he must want more of an answer. So, Mr. Speaker, we're really encouraged by the work that our partners are doing across the province to deliver health care, and we're going to continue to do so, Mr. Speaker, to make sure it's in a sustainable way, one that is in every community across this province.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Immigration. Language training, employment services and family counselling will always be needed in Nova Scotia to attract and retain new immigrants to our province. Most of these services are provided by organizations like ISANS and the YMCA, whose dedicated staff must reapply for the same provincial funding every time. This creates an unnecessary administrative burden for those working at the front lines of integration. My question is, will this government consider moving to multi-year funding agreements with the handful of organizations assisting immigrants here in Nova Scotia?
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, would you please call address in reply?
We now call address in reply. The Honourable Member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, it is my privilege to rise in this House to address in reply to the government speech to the throne, as read by Brigadier General the Honourable J.J. Grant. Now, I've served the constituency of Lunenburg for 3 years, and I pledge to continue to represent the people of Lunenburg to the best of my ability, each and every day, to help this government build a stronger